So let's open it up for questions. We'll start with this room, and anyone online, just follow the directions on your screen for how to submit. Actually, we'll take the first one. It's still kind of fun. We have a lot of questions actually here, Joe. Not a surprise. So I'll start online, and then we'll go to the audience here. This is from a GW student in Brittany Morit in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Currently, Cubans fleeing Cuba are allowed to stay in the U.S. as exiles, a result of the special political status. They're here under the idea of political asylum. Now, if we completely normalize relations with Cuba, or simply lift all travel bans for Cuban Americans, does that defeat the purpose of the status? Right. Why would someone who's an exile and suffered under Castro want to keep returning? Wouldn't that undermine their status as political refugees and cause for the status to be permanently lifted, which would do more damage than good? Interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and it's also a question that's used for local politics. Brittany was her name?
Yep.
Brittany, it's used for local politics in South Florida a great deal. It's sort of the boogeyman. And if you take that argument to its context, or to its final, it's you're arguing against yourself, because you're basically saying, look, if you travel to Cuba so much, you are therefore not a refugee. Therefore, we need to take out the Cuban Adjustment Act. But here's the problem. If you're making that argument, you've already lost, because you're saying that people that go to Cuba aren't victims of persecution. Let's be clear. The Cuban Adjustment Act says that anybody who makes a legal entry into the United States, a year and a day after being here, they get to adjust their status to the residency. It is a privilege under law. It was put in place during one of the worst periods in Cuba, where executions were very common in the late 60s. Obviously, Cuba was this Cold War outpost 90 miles from the United States. Look, at some point, the Cuban Adjustment Act is going to have to be revisited. But the nature of travel today to Cuba has to do with family. And yes, you left under a fear of persecution, and you are a refugee. But if your mother can't get out of Cuba, or your son can't get out of Cuba, what are your choices? And I think that it would be inhumane to sort of say, all right, we've got to get rid of the Cuban Adjustment Act because people want to see their family. I don't think people take trips to Cuba lightly, and I don't think they take leaving Cuba lightly. It comes with tremendous repercussions inside of Cuba when you sign up to leave. Quite literally, you're removed from your job, you're removed from a lot of the social programs in Cuba. People show up and take an inventory of every single piece of possession in your house, which must remain when you leave the country. So this is not a step that people take lightly, and there is still, Cuba still has over 300 dissidents that are recognized by Amnesty International. They're there. There are clearly human rights violations. This is still a dictatorship of half a century, the longest in the history of the hemisphere. So I don't think that the Cuban Adjustment Act, by definition, because I go see my family, would have to be lifted. And finally, it's part of the law, and it's going to be in the books until it's removed. And I think there's still a great need for it. Now, go forward 10 years to your scenario. Let's say we have in Cuba some form of democracy, some form of opening. There is a strong bilateral relationship. I think many, both in the United States and Cuba, would want to remove the Cuban Adjustment Act, because we'd want to bring young guys like Federico, who may be in Cuba, and we want to bring him to train him in the United States so that he can then do a call center in Cuba. Right now, you and I dial 611 on our phone, and some guy on the other side of the earth answers that phone. Some Pakistani or some Indian answers that phone and explains to us how to use that. But imagine in Cuba, where you're talking about 28% of the population is a college education. A huge portion of it is technical degrees, engineering and others. The possibility of training those folks, integrate them into the Latin system, is amazing. And now, you might not want to bring someone to train them if the guy runs away and a year and a day is a U.S. citizen. So under those circumstances, it may behoove both countries, if there is a responsible government in Cuba, that we have bilateral relations, to find another migratory system. It might even be in U.S. interest to drop the number of people that come under immigration and go for technical degrees. There are a lot of tech degrees in Cuba which would be very useful in America. For example, nursing degrees. The U.S. in the next 5 years, I think, over 40% of registered nurses are going to go into retirement. How are we going to replace these folks? And right now, we're replacing them with people from South America and the Philippines, the Caribbean islands. Cuba may be able to provide some of that. And so we're going to have probably technical or expertise going from Cuba.
Let me go to the room. We have a mic, if anybody would like to ask a question here. Yes, sir. And please identify yourself and fire away.
Yeah, I'm Tim Ashby. I'm the head of the Cuba Emerging Markets Practice for the Sonnenschein Law
Tim,
Firm.
nice to see
And
you.
I want to pick up on something that Joe said, and that's about the President's directive that was issued by the White House on April 14th. I met with the people at OFAC at the Treasury Department a couple of weeks ago, specifically asked them about those directives, and they said, look, until the new regulations are issued, Cuban Americans, can, as Joe said, can only go once a year. That's still the old regulations apply. And unless they get a specific license, which means an application to OFAC, which will probably not be approved, they actually are in violation of U.S. law. That, as an attorney, that astonishes me when the President of the United States issues a directive, which I consider policy, and yet a bureaucratic part of the U.S. government basically says, I'm sorry, if they go now, they're in violation of U.S. law. I wondered if Joe could comment about that.
Let me just repeat the question for the audience in case they didn't hear it, is that the President's announced a new policy, but the regulations haven't been updated yet to actually allow the travel and the remittances to go from the travel for Cuban Americans to go
Correct.
to Cuba and the remittances to move from the United States into Cuba. So, Joe, how quickly may that come about, and how does that happen?
Well, look, I would obviously, I've met with folks in the administration about this issue, as I'm sure Tim has as part of the Sonnenschein Group. It is very important. I'll use this example. You know, I talked about the fact that huge numbers of Cubans were already going illegally. And it has had a very negative impact in the spoken politics in South Florida. In other words, and this is for comedic purposes, but it's a good example. You know, some guy who's growing pot in his basement is not going to go to the march on legalizing pot because he doesn't want to make himself a target. He's doing an illegal act, and so he certainly doesn't want to play an advocate role. In this case, people are going to Cuba because they want to see their family. They've got a link to Cuba. But they sort of don't engage in the debate because they don't want to be noticed. They want to be able to take a third country trip. They want to be able to see their family. Sure, I go to the Dominican Republic. I pretend I'm there, but then I go into Cuba. The Cubans don't stamp the passport, so I'm okay, which in truth you're not. In truth, if the U.S. wanted to prosecute, they could find out that you're doing this because every air carrier that goes to Cuba must submit that information. But the U.S., there are so many, it would be almost impossible to bring these folks up on charges. But I think it will change the discourse in Miami and in the Cuban community and in the broader community if we had a quick resolution to this. For example, I'll give you the majority of people that are traveling now, by the way, are much younger people. The median age, I think, is somewhere under 45. But use the context of people a little bit younger than you and myself, who the concept of a travel agency is a foreign thing. Most folks, the age of this young audience here, buy all their tickets on the internet. It's a natural thing to do. You can't do that. So here's the President of the United States sort of saying, you should go. We're going to change Cuba from the bottom up. I want Cubans to engage. They're ambassadors to changing Cuba. And yet, if you get on a computer and you try to buy a ticket to Cuba, it cannot be done. You have to physically enter a travel agency, which has to be licensed by the federal government, which then buys it from another type of ticket seller, which is also licensed by the federal government, which then sends you to Cuba. And the rates are relatively expensive. Part of that expense is the bureaucracy around this. And so I agree with Tim, and I agree with a lot of the folks who do the politics of that it's important for the administration. And I know they know it's important for them to give directives. I know it's very difficult because you've got a State Department where not all the people are obviously in Treasury. You know, Tim Geithner is trying to hold up the world economy. This little thing, the OFAC office is a really small thing. But I encourage the administration to get this out quickly and to be broad in its construct. Because these rules are written in a very sort of got you sort of way. Yes, you can do telecommunications service to Cuba, but I've got to license you. But even if I license you, you can't transfer money to Cuba or receive payments without this license. And if you don't have this license, you can't put a switch. And it's so complex, which I'm sure is good for the legal department and Sonnenschein, who are experts at this, but is not what you want to promote the president's policy, which is to move forward. The president the other day had a great phrase, and I was very impressed that he understood the subtlety of it. When he announced they asked him a question. He said, look, I think it's unfortunate that the Cubans charge, or it's abusive that the Cubans charge 20% for exchange. It's a brutal exchange rate. But the excuse the Cubans had to put that, I mean, the Cubans always have an excuse to get an extra buck, but the reason they did it is because we don't allow companies to buy the convertible currency. So when I go to a Western Union and I give them $100 to be delivered to Simon in Cuba, under the directive of the White House, and Tim is an expert on this, so he'll correct me if I'm wrong, requires the Western Union to buy dollars in Havana. In other words, dollars must be delivered, even though dollars can't be used in Cuba. So then the dollars have to be converted to euros, and then the euros have to buy the Cuban convertible currency, which is a second currency that circulates in Cuba. And so they get you twice, and you've got 20%. And I think if the U.S. would simply back off on the requirement of delivering dollars, in other words, allowing Western Union to buy the convertible currency right out, I think what you'd find is that the Cubans would be sort of forced to drop a 10% surcharge. And in the end, I think it benefits the Cubans to have more money circulating in Cuba's economy, because in the end, they are going to benefit from it. There's no question. There's no private enterprise in the way we speak of it. But it certainly would make the dollar flow much easier. And by the way, because we're suffering economically, so are the Europeans. And so there's much less European tourism in Cuba today. An interesting aside, many hotels in Cuba today are filled with Cubans from the island, which until 7 or 8 years ago, it was illegal for Cubans to enter a hotel. In other words, it was a complete tourist apartheid. So if I, as a foreigner but a Cuban, got to the door of the hotel with Simon, my son, who lives in Cuba, you would not be allowed to enter. I'd have to ask for special permission, or I couldn't wait for you at the bar and you come in to see me. Under the new rules that the Cubans have got in place, Cubans can stay in the hotel. But what's happened is that Cuban Americans in Miami are sending money to their family, and their family stays in the hotels in Cuba, which it's opening up the system. I'm not saying that this is a perfect system, nor am I advocating this is good enough, but it gives you a reality of what's out there, and Tim is absolutely right. The president's policy is inclusive. It is expansive, and it requires a people-to-people engagement, and that it be held up by the bureaucracy, by our inability to write a rule that says, I can go as often as I want as long as I have a second cousin in Cuba. I think it's a mistake. And by the way, it doesn't allow the policy to mature, which is, I think, one of the strengths of the policy. It will moor U.S. policy to a tangible center in domestic politics, which hasn't existed. And you know, when your family is there in Cuba, you're much less likely to want abrupt and violent change or abrupt policy. You want continuity. You certainly want progress because your family's in Cuba. You want them to live better, but you certainly don't want very aggressive exchanges. And so I think that by the regs hurrying up, I think we would do a great service, the administration, to furthering this policy and to continuing to get support from a sort of moderate Cuban Americans.
Let me take another question in here. Yes, sir.
My name is Christopher. My question is, and both of you kind of touched on this, that demographically speaking, the Cuban community has voted more conservatively than other Hispanic communities in the United States. So, you know, you're talking about more progressive voter registration, you know, more liberal voters in the Cuban community. How much of Obama's policy plan do you think is continuing to shepherd that, you know, the politics behind this, or is it, you know, is it driven by the policy or the politics? I guess is really my question. And how do you reconcile those two priorities?
Let me do the first part, and you take the second part. What's important to realize about Florida, you know, and just to, again, one of the reasons we're having this conversation today is because Florida is the largest swing state in the presidential election, in American politics, in presidential elections. Texas, at least, has been irrevocably Republican, California irrevocably Democrat, and so Florida is the biggest swing state in the country. So this is one of the reasons why this matters so much, because as I said earlier, what happens in this community actually already created a president once, just very recently, so it's clearly impactful. So what's important about the demographics of Florida is, just let me say two things about this. One is that the Cuban community is changing. It's the post-Mariel Cubans are becoming citizens, are registering and becoming active voters now in a way they never had been before. The second generation Cubans are becoming more plentiful, and the older original exiles are becoming a smaller part of the overall Cuban electorate. So the Cuban electorate is becoming less hardline Republican, and in fact, the post-Mariel Cubans and the second generation Cubans are about 2-to-1 Democrat. They're very similar to the other Hispanic communities in the United States. One of the reasons why their vote share is increasing is because of something that, frankly, we figured out back in 2003 and 2004, which was the only Hispanics, the only Cubans registered to vote in South Florida were Republican Cubans. That because Democrats had always seen the Cuban community in South Florida as being irrevocably Republican, there was never any kind of voter registration effort. And we figured this out through market research, that there was this huge pool of potential voters that nobody had ever registered. Well, those people are very heavily registered now, and in part because of we figured this thing out, and we suggested to some people that they may want to go register this vast untapped pool of Cubans. The second thing that's happening is that the Hispanic electorate in Florida itself is also changing. There's been a huge increase of Central Americans and South Americans and Puerto Ricans in Florida, which also changes the debate on Spanish language media. This is no longer media that's dominated by sort of the right-wing Cuban media the way that it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's Colombian television stations, there's Puerto Rican radio stations. There's now, if you're a speaker of Spanish in Florida, you have a huge new opportunity to engage in non-right-wing talk, right? Which has dominated political discourse, which is also a very new phenomenon. This is really only in the last 5 or 6 years. And today, Florida's Hispanic vote is now minority Cuban. The majority of the Hispanic vote in Florida is non-Cuban, and
also is also Democratic.
And
majority
Democratic.
In 2006.
Well, in 2006, and this is important, which was the precursor to what happened with Obama, and then I'll let Joe answer the rest of this, is that Obama in 2006, in the statewide elections in 2006, the majority of Hispanic votes in Florida were non-Cuban and Democratic, and prior to even to Obama. So what's happening is, if you extrapolate all this, is that this huge growth of the non-Cuban Hispanic population in the United States, right, is not only made states like New Mexico and Colorado and Nevada very Democratic in this last election, it's made Florida Democratic. And the argument that I would make to everybody in this room is, if the current trend lines continue the way they are, with the Hispanic population now getting much more, voting in much higher numbers, registering in much higher numbers, and voting 2-to-1 Democratic, Florida starts to look like California, right? Texas starts to look like Florida. And I think that you're going to see, just because the demographics underneath these states, that the DNC is having its next big meeting in Texas, because they think that if they invest money wisely, Texas will be a competitive state in 2012. I agree with that, by the way. We agree with that. And so part of what's happening with Florida is part of this broader story of the Republicans blowing it big time with this fastest growing part of the American electorate, the Hispanic community, which has made now Florida into a lean, you could call it a purple state, might be a lean Democrat state now in the presidential election, and which is a huge change. And some of that has to do with the change of the Cuban vote. But a lot of it also has to do with the growth of this non-Cuban part of the population.
By the way, the half of the president's majority in Florida came from Dade County alone. Just to give you a construct, 67 counties. More than half of the margin of 250,000 votes or 240,000 votes that he got in Florida came from Dade County alone. It's why folks from South Florida used to be dominant in the politics and in Democrat circles, because it's just the votes are huge, but the swing was tremendously helpful. And to give you an example of the success, leaving the Cuba stuff, the success of Obama's folks copying a lot of the initial work that Simon had done with Sergio Bendixen and others. Just the Puerto Rican vote alone had I think it was an 8-point shift. If Andre were here, he'd probably scream it out, but probably an 8 or 9 point increase for the Democrats. I think they got up to 70% of the Puerto Rican vote in the Orlando area, which is, again, a huge center. And I think that when we look at redistricting in 2012, which there's a very good campaign and petition campaign going on in Florida, I think it's called Fair Districts for All, you may see a Puerto Rican seat in the Orlando area, which I think would be fabulous for Florida politics. And you're going to see probably 2 seats added to Florida. So when Simon says this big state, it's going to get even bigger and more important. And to be quite honest, a Floridian, I want it to always be a swing state. I'm arguing against my own party here, but I think it makes, in Iowa or in New Hampshire, they know it's a fascinating thing. Whenever Simon's done New Hampshire politics, but when you're in New Hampshire, these people actually know the president. Yeah, he was in my living room. Oh, yeah, that guy had donuts with me. I'm not saying Florida goes that far, but they're in the state an awful lot. There are 5 major TV markets, so that they've got to work the state, so it's important. And I think the Cuban community, the Democratic Party, when I chaired it, Karen Thurman as chairman of the state party has done a fantastic job. Bill Nelson has taken the reins of leadership in the state, and I think this focusing on voter registration, there are some outside groups that are doing fabulous work in South Florida. That they don't get caught up in the noise. They move forward and do it, and it had a tremendous effect. One of the things that was great for us was that we addressed the Cuba thing respectfully. Look, we as Democrats want a free and democratic Cuba, just like every good-hearted American should, and every Cuban wants. The distinction is that Democrats in the past said, don't even go there. You just can't go there because, and so we gave the room to the Republicans, and they took that room and quite literally changed the whole scenario. And I think that by doing this, look, one of the things I would do, they have these huge swearing-in ceremonies, which I think the new director of Citizen Services, the acting director, got rid of them. But you're talking about 15,000 people registering at once at the Miami Beach Convention Center. And I'd sit there in the parking lot all day and just register thousands of people. And they overwhelmingly, they're registering Democratic.
Let me take one more in the room, and that'll be the last one today. Anything else, anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Wait, sorry. Did I? Here. Go ahead.
My name is Jeremy Caverly, and I was just wondering if, based sort of the dynamic between your election for Congress and the numbers that came away from Obama's campaign as well, and then looking forward to the Senate race, if you think some of the things that have been discussed here are going to really play out either on both sides of the primary or in the general down in Florida.
I don't know. It's interesting. I don't think there's been a layout on Cuba policy at all yet. I think that Charlie Crist's instincts will be to go with the Diaz-Balarts, and they will probably endorse him. Marco Rubio, who's filed also for the Senate seat, Marco Rubio, who's filed, who I know, his instincts will be to go to the right also. And Kendrick has a history of sort of being in the middle here. And so Kendrick may have a little bit of room here, and maybe to his advantage. But if he has a challenger in the primary, I think there may be a good debate in the center of this. And so we may see it lay out in a very different way. But I also don't think it's going to get into the governor's race. In the past, this was the entree. Cuba politics was the entree to the Cuban community. You had to, if you're running for president, you would say, and the National Guard will invade Cuba next week. I don't think that's necessary anymore, much to the credit of Cuban Americans and politicians. And that's a good thing. So we'll see. There are some who fear, for example, the Cuba Study Group, which is one of the reasons they advocate opening up of travel for Americans, which NDN has not done that yet, and maybe the right position a year from now or some time from now, is because they believe that the debate in the Senate race is going to be hard to the right and will sort of limit our ability, the president's mobility on it, trying to win a Senate seat. I'm not so sure. I think Obama has shown a tremendous resistance to be pushed around. And I think he knows what he wants to do, or someone in there is very certain about what they want to do, and all the folks in there, from Dan Restrepo, who I think spent the last month and a half, not only as being in South Florida, but South Florida is the surrogate center for national Hispanic news. Both national Hispanic newscasts come out of South Florida, and so Dan had to be there as a sort of foreign policy expert on Latin America. And Dan serving as national security, I think that's going to be very helpful. And I don't think Dan let himself be pushed around. He had some very tough issues that he had to face down there, but I think the Obama administration kept course, and hopefully they'll do that.
Joe, any final thoughts before we go?
Look, I obviously I want to congratulate you and NDN and the help that they gave me in sort of being leaders on this. It's made a tremendous difference. I also want to encourage people who watch this. I think the president has given the Cuban community tremendous leeway to act. It would be sad if they don't. These are opportunities lost. It's not like Obama can revisit it. He's got a lot of fish to fry. Cuba is not the center of the universe, nor should it be with all the problems that our country is facing. But it is in our sphere of influence. It is a place we want to have. And I want to close up on what you began on, because not only is Cuba important, Latin America is important. And my grandchildren and your grandchildren are going to have much more in relation to what happens in Latin America for our economic wealth, with our cultural link, and our national interest is going to be more based in the American hemisphere than it's going to be European-centric. And that's why it's important to have multilateral institutions that work. It's important to engage in this politics so you don't lose control of it. And in the long term, it is why I think your efforts in creating the Latin American policy initiative, the LAPI project that's working out of here with Nelson Cunningham, is tremendously important. And I encourage all of you to not only participate, but become part of the NDN family and make a difference. Because Simon, Latin America is very different. It's tough to raise money for it, yet it's very important. When you walk into a room like this and you ask young American leaders how many times they've been to Latin America, and unfortunately many times it's, I was in Cancun for a weekend during spring break, but they have no nexus to what is one of the economic center, natural resource centers for our country and for our growth. And so we have to have a much better relationship with that. And I think NDN has set the right framework for that. So I congratulate you and thank you for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joe.